February 20th, 1943, 0600 hours. A canvas tent in Jebel Queif, Tunisia. Major General Lloyd Fredendall sat behind a desk buried 40 feet underground. Above him, American soldiers were retreating in chaos. Around him, staff officers avoided eye contact. Outside, the sound of distant artillery had stopped. Silence is worse than shelling. Fredendall's command post had been carved into Rock 70. Engineers spent weeks building it while the front line begged for reinforcements. Now that front line no longer existed, 2 days earlier, German panzers punched through Kasserine Pass with such speed that American units dissolved before they could radio for help. Entire battalions vanished. Equipment worth millions burned. In the sand, over 6,000 American soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. This was not a setback. This was a collapse, and Washington knew it. Eisenhower's message arrived that morning. It didn't ask for an explanation. It demanded a name. Someone would answer for this. Someone would be removed. Someone's career would end in the Tunisian desert. But the message didn't stop there. It included a second order. Lieutenant General Georges Patton Jr. was being flown in from Morocco. Not to assist, not to advise. To replace. Patton arrived 48 hours later. He walked through camps where men openly wept. He saw officers who'd abandoned their posts. He found a command structure so broken that nobody could answer a simple question. Who was in charge? What Patton did next didn't just change the North African campaign. It turned the United States Army against itself. This is the story of 11 days that redefined American military command. Between March 6th and March 17th, 1943, George Patton will strip officers of rank, humiliate men in front of their units, and enforce discipline so brutal that even his superiors will question whether he's gone too far. Soldiers will call it tyranny. Eisenhower will call it necessary. History will call it effective, but effectiveness has a cost. By the time Patton finishes, the Second Corps will fight differently, but it will also fear differently. Careers will be destroyed not by the enemy, but by their own commander. Men will perform not out of loyalty, but out of terror. Within 2 weeks, American forces will advance. They will take objectives. They will prove they can fight. But the question this documentary must answer is darker. When does discipline become cruelty? When does leadership become revenge? And who pays the price when a general decides that winning the war means breaking his own men first? What happened at Kasserine Pass didn't just expose American weakness. It revealed what the U.S. Army was willing to do to fix it. February 14th, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The German attack began at dawn. Within hours, American defenses crumbled like paper. This wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. Rommel's Afrika Korps, supported by the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions, tore through the Kasserine Pass with a ferocity that left American units paralyzed. Young soldiers, many seeing combat for the first time, broke ranks and ran. Officers screamed contradictory orders. Radio discipline collapsed into panic. By nightfall on the 15th, over 2,400 American soldiers were dead or wounded. Another 3,700 were captured, many without firing a shot. Entire artillery batteries were abandoned intact. Tanks were left running. Crews fleeing on foot. The numbers were devastating. But the humiliation was worse. German commanders couldn't believe what they were seeing. Rommel himself noted in his diary that American troops lacked the will to fight. Captured U.S. soldiers told their interrogators they'd received no coherent orders. Some didn't even know where their officers were. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a public humiliation on the world stage. British forces, already skeptical of American combat effectiveness, whispered that the U.S. Army wasn't ready. Churchill questioned whether American troops could be trusted in future operations. Stalin, watching from Moscow, wondered if opening a second front in Europe was even possible with Allies this week. But the real failure wasn't on the failure. Wondered if opening a second front in Europe was even possible with Allies this week. But the real failure wasn't on the Wasco. Wondered if opening a second front in Europe was even possible with Allies in Europe, was even possible with Allies this week. Battlefield. It was in the command tent. Major General Lloyd Fredendall had spent weeks fortifying his personal headquarters, a bunker so deep and so elaborate that troops called it Shangri-La. While his men dug foxholes with helmets, Fredendall diverted engineering units to carve him a command post into solid rock. He micromanaged from 70 miles behind the front. He issued orders based on maps, not reality. He placed units in exposed positions because he didn't understand the terrain. When junior officers questioned his decisions, he relieved them, and when the Germans attacked, Fredendall's response was paralysis. He didn't visit the front. He didn't consolidate his forces. He sent contradictory orders that arrived hours too late. By the time he requested help, there was nothing left to help. The soldiers knew it. The officers knew it. And within days, Eisenhower knew it too. Fredendall had to go, but removing him wasn't enough. The entire command structure had failed. The Second Corps' 19,000 men had been exposed as unprepared, poorly led, and incapable of standing against veteran German forces. Eisenhower needed more than a replacement. He needed someone willing to tear the Second Corps apart and rebuild. If from scratch, he needed someone ruthless enough to destroy careers, break egos, and enforce discipline without mercy. He needed George Patton, and Patton arrived ready to burn it all down. Asterisk. 3 men would define what happened next. Each represented a different philosophy of command. Each had something to prove. And each would collide over a single question. How far should a general go to fix a broken army? George S. Patton, Jr., the enforcer Patton, arrived in Tunisia on March 6th wearing polished boots, ivory-handled pistols, and a reputation for brutality. He was 57 years old. He'd spent his entire career preparing for war, and Kasserine Pass had given him exactly what he wanted. Total authority. Patton believed in one thing above all else. Fear works. Not fear of the enemy. Fear of him. He didn't see himself as a manager or a strategist. He saw himself as a warlord. His philosophy was simple: soldiers fight harder when they're more afraid of their commander than they are of dying. Discipline wasn't a tool. It was a weapon, and he wielded it like a man who had nothing to lose. Patton had been sidelined before, passed over for commands, criticized for being too aggressive, too flamboyant, too reckless. Kasserine Pass was his chance to prove that his way, the brutal, uncompromising, old-school way, was the only way. He didn't arrive to rebuild morale. He arrived to break it first. Lloyd Fredendall, the scapegoat for Fredendall, was already finished. Eisenhower had made the decision to relieve him days before Patton arrived. But Fredendall didn't know that yet. He was 54 years old, a career officer who'd risen through the ranks by following orders and avoiding risks. He wasn't incompetent, he was safe. And safety had been rewarded in peacetime, but war exposed him. Fredendall believed in hierarchy, procedure, and control from the rear. He trusted his staff. He delegated authority. He micromanaged details while missing the larger picture. And when Kasserine Pass collapsed, he blamed his subordinates. He wasn't a villain. He was a symbol of everything the old U.S. Army had gotten wrong. Promoting men for loyalty instead of ability, valuing seniority over competence, and assuming that command could be learned from a desk. Patton would make an example of him. Not publicly, Eisenhower wouldn't allow that. But privately, Fredendall's removal would send a message to every officer in North Africa: failure will not be tolerated. And no one is untouchable. Dwight D. Eisenhower. The Judge Eisenhower was caught between two impossible pressures: from above, Washington and Churchill were demanding results. The North African campaign was supposed to prove that American forces could fight. Instead, Kasserine Pass had proven the opposite. Every day without a victory was another day of humiliation. From below, his officers were divided. Some believed Patton was exactly what the Second Corps needed. Others feared he would destroy morale entirely. Eisenhower was 52 years old. He'd never commanded troops in combat. He was a planner, a diplomat, a coordinator. His strength wasn't battlefield tactics, it was managing egos. And now he had to manage Patton. Eisenhower knew what Patton was capable of. He'd seen him in training exercises, brilliant, aggressive, and completely uncontrollable. Patton didn't follow orders. He interpreted them. He didn't respect authority. He respected results. So Eisenhower made a calculated gamble. He gave Patton full authority over the Second Corps, no oversight, no restrictions, total operational freedom. But he also made one thing clear. If Patton went too far, Eisenhower would end his career. The question was, what did too far mean? Because Patton was about to find out. March 6, 1943, 1400 hours. The Second Corps headquarters, Jebel Queif. Patton's first order wasn't tactical. It was psychological. Every officer above the rank of captain was summoned to headquarters. No exceptions, no delays. When they arrived, Patton was waiting in full uniform, helmet, pistols, riding crop in hand. He didn't sit. He stood, and he spoke for exactly 4 minutes. I don't care what you've been through. I don't care what you've lost. I care about one thing: discipline. This Corps has become a mob. You've allowed it. And now you will fix it, or I will replace every single one of you. He wasn't finished. Effective immediately. No officer will appear in public without a helmet and full uniform. No exceptions, not in the mess, not in the latrine, nowhere. Any man I see without a helmet will be fined. Any officer I see without proper insignia will be relieved on the spot. The room was silent. You have 24 hours to enforce this in your units. After that, I will enforce it myself. He dismissed them, no questions, no discussion. And he meant every word. The fines began immediately. Within hours, Patton was driving through camps, stopping vehicles, inspecting uniforms. He fined a colonel $25 for not wearing leggings. He fined a major $50 for an unbuttoned collar. He stopped a truck full of soldiers and ordered the driver to turn around, because nobody was wearing helmets. The amounts didn't matter. The humiliation did. Officers who'd survived Kasserine Pass, who'd watched their men die, were now being lectured about uniform standards. They were furious. But they were also terrified, because Patton wasn't bluffing. On March 7th, he relieved a battalion commander for lack of discipline. The man's crime? His soldiers had been resting without helmets after a 12-hour march. Patton arrived unannounced, saw the violation, and removed him on the spot. No warning, no second chance. Just gone. The message was clear. There's no such thing as a small mistake anymore. But the real pressure was just beginning. March 8th. Patton assembled his senior staff division commanders, regimental officers, logistics chiefs. These were men who'd been fighting for weeks. Men who'd lost soldiers, equipment, credibility. Patton stood at the front of the room and said, I am not interested in your excuses. I am not interested in your fatigue. I am interested in results. You will advance. You will take objectives. You will prove that this Corps can fight. Then came the ultimatum. If you cannot do this, tell me now. I will relieve you with no prejudice. You can return to the States with honor. But if you stay and you fail, I will destroy you. Silence. You have 1 hour to decide. No one resigned. But everyone understood. This wasn't leadership. This was Survival. The inspection tours became relentless. Patton didn't command from headquarters. He drove to the front every single day, sometimes twice a day. He arrived unannounced. He demanded immediate answers. He humiliated officers in front of their men. On March 10th, he found a supply depot in disarray. Ammunition crates stacked incorrectly, fuel drums unsecured. The officer in charge tried to explain that they'd just arrived, that they were short-staffed, that Patton cut him off. "You're relieved. Report to headquarters for reassignment," the officer stammered. "Sir, now." He was gone within the hour. On March 11th, Patton stopped at a field hospital. Wounded soldiers were lying on stretchers outside because the tents were full. A medical officer explained they were overwhelmed. They'd requested more supplies. They were doing everything they. Patton interrupted. "I don't care what you requested. I care what you have. Get these men inside, or I'll find someone who will." He left without another word. The medical staff worked through the night. Not because they agreed with Patton, because they were terrified of him. Careers were ending daily by March 12th. Patton had relieved or reassigned over a dozen officers, some for incompetence, some for hesitation, some for questioning his orders. He created a culture where failure was punished instantly and success was expected silently. There were no rewards, no praise, only consequences. One colonel later wrote, "We didn't serve under Patton, we survived under him." But the worst was still coming, because Patton's campaign wasn't just about discipline. It was about humiliation. And he was about to make an example that would haunt the Second Corps for the rest of the war. March 13th, the breaking point. A logistics officer, a major with 18 years of service, failed to deliver ammunition to a forward position on time. The delay was 90 minutes. The position was never attacked. No one died. But the order had been explicit. Delivery by 0800 hours. Patton found out. 1,000 hours. He drove to the logistics depot himself. He found the major supervising unloading operations. And in front of 40 enlisted men, Patton tore the rank insignia off the major's uniform. "You are no longer an officer in this corps. Report to personnel for reassignment to the rear." The major tried to speak. Patton turned and walked away. The men watched in silence. That night, word spread through every unit in the Second Corps. "Patton will break you, publicly, without hesitation." But Eisenhower was starting to worry. Reports were reaching Supreme Headquarters. Officers were complaining, not just about Patton's methods, but about the effect on morale. Men were exhausted. Units were tense. Some officers were requesting transfers rather than serve under Patton. Eisenhower sent a message. "Discipline is necessary, cruelty is not. Do not confuse the two." Patton read the message. He filed it. And he continued exactly as before. Because Patton believed something Eisenhower didn't. You cannot rebuild a broken army with kindness. You rebuild it with fear. And in 6 days, he would get his chance to prove it. Asterisk. But Patton wasn't just terrorizing officers for sport. Behind the humiliation, behind the fines and the firings, he was systematically dismantling the command structure that had failed at Kasserine Pass, and he was rebuilding it based on one principle. Authority flows forward, not backward. The command structure was rebuilt from scratch. Fredendall had commanded from 70 miles behind the front. His orders arrived late, written on maps that didn't match reality. Junior officers had no autonomy. Every decision required approval from the rear. Patton inverted the entire system. On March 7th, he issued a directive. Division commanders will operate from forward positions. Regimental commanders will be visible to their men. Company officers will lead from the front, not from command posts. This wasn't symbolic. It was structural. Patton moved the Second Corps headquarters 40 miles closer to the front. He forced division Commanders to relocate their command posts within artillery range. Officers who'd spent weeks in relative safety were now sleeping in tents within earshot of German guns, and he made one rule non-negotiable. If you issue an order, you must be close enough to see it executed. This solved the core problem that had destroyed American forces at Kasserine: distance. Fredendall had been so far removed from the fighting that he was commanding ghosts. Patton ensured that every officer could see, hear, and feel the consequences of their decisions. It was brutal. But it worked. Tactical doctrine was completely reread in Kasserine had exposed a deeper failure. American units didn't know how to fight as a coordinated force. Artillery operated independently. Infantry advanced without tank support. Reconnaissance units reported to the wrong commanders. Patton's solution was surgical. He appointed Omar Bradley as his deputy commander with one explicit task: create a unified tactical manual and enforce it across every unit in the 2nd Corps. Within 72 hours, Bradley produced a 14-page field order that redefined how American forces would operate. Combined arms coordination. Infantry, armor, and artillery would train together and fight together. No exceptions. Decentralized execution. Company commanders were given authority to adapt orders based on battlefield conditions, but they had to justify every decision immediately after. Aggressive reconnaissance. Patton demanded real-time intelligence. Reconnaissance. Units were ordered forward daily, regardless of risk. This wasn't theoretical. Patton enforced it immediately. On March 9th, he observed a training exercise where an infantry battalion advanced without waiting for tank support. He halted the exercise, assembled the officers, and said, "If you fight like this in combat, you will die like you did at Kasserine. We will repeat this exercise until you do it correctly." They repeated it 6 times that day. The officer corps was purged and rebuilt. Patton didn't just relieve incompetent officers. He replaced them with men who embodied his philosophy: aggression, visibility, and accountability. He promoted junior officers who performed well under fire at Kasserine. He brought in commanders from other theaters who'd proven themselves in combat. And he made one thing clear: rank meant nothing. Results meant everything. By March 12th, over 30% of senior leadership positions in the 2nd Corps had changed hands. This wasn't routine rotation. This was a purge. One regimental commander, a man with 22 years of service, was replaced by a 34-year-old lieutenant colonel who'd led a successful counterattack during Kasserine. The older officer protested to Eisenhower. Eisenhower upheld Patton's decision. The message was absolute. The old army is dead. Seniority will not protect you. Only performance matters now. Training became relentless and realistic. Patton believed Kasserine had happened because American soldiers had trained for peacetime maneuvers, not real war, big practiced movement. They'd rehearsed tactics, but they hadn't experienced the chaos, confusion, and terror of actual combat. So Patton brought the chaos to them. He ordered live-fire exercises: artillery, shells landing 100 yards from advancing infantry. He forced units to operate under simulated communication breakdowns. He had officers deliberately issue contradictory orders to teach soldiers how to think independently. It was dangerous. Men were injured. Equipment was damaged, but Patton didn't care. If a man can't handle artillery fire in training, he'll die in combat. Better he learns here than in front of a German machine gun. The exercises were conducted daily. Even units that had just returned from the front were sent back to training. There was no rest, no recovery period. Just constant, relentless preparation. Officers hated it. Soldiers resented it. But within a week, units were moving faster, communicating better, and executing orders with a precision that hadn't existed before Kasserine. Logistics were overhauled completely. One of the most catastrophic failures at Kasserine had been supply. Ammunition didn't arrive. Fuel ran out. Medical supplies were delayed. The logistics system had collapsed under pressure. Patton attacked this problem personally. He appointed a new logistics commander, Colonel Walter Muller, and gave him 48 hours to audit the entire supply chain. Muller reported back with a list of failures, redundant approval processes, unclear chain of command, no priority system for critical supplies. Patton's response was immediate. He eliminated every approval layer between frontline units and supply depots. He created a priority system: ammunition first, fuel second, everything else third. And he made logistics officers personally accountable. If a unit ran out of ammunition, the responsible officer would be relieved within 24 hours. By March 14th, supply delivery times had been cut in half. It wasn't magic. It was accountability. But all of this had one purpose. Patton wasn't rebuilding the Second Corps to make it competent. He was rebuilding it to make it ruthless. Every structural change, every new doctrine, every personnel decision pointed toward one goal: turn this broken army into a weapon capable of attacking, not just defending. Because Eisenhower had given Patton more than authority. He'd given him a mission. On March 17th, the Second Corps would attack German positions at Algetter. It would be the first American offensive operation since Kasserine Pass, and Patton had 11 days to prepare an army that had just been destroyed. The changes he made weren't theoretical. They were about to be tested in combat. And if they failed, Patton's career would end in the Tunisian desert. Section 7. Test. Battle OR Decision PAYOF March 17th, 1943, 0600 hours. Algetter, Tunisia. The attack began exactly on schedule. American artillery opened fire at dawn, over 200 guns hammering German positions with a coordination that hadn't existed 2 weeks earlier. Infantry advanced behind rolling barrages. Tanks moved in formation with infantry support. Reconnaissance units had already identified enemy strongpoints. This wasn't the same army that had broken at Kasserine Pass. Within 3 hours, the 1st Infantry Division had seized its primary objectives. The 1st Armored Division pushed through the Gumtree Road, forcing Italian units into retreat. By noon, American forces had advanced 6 miles, the deepest penetration into Axis-held territory since the North African campaign began. Patton watched from a forward observation post, binoculars in hand. For the first time in weeks, American soldiers were attacking. And they were winning. The contrast was undeniable at Kasserine Pass. American units had dissolved under pressure. Officers lost control. Soldiers abandoned equipment and fled. Entire battalions surrendered without sustained resistance. At Algetter, the same army, many of the same soldiers, fought with a discipline that shocked even veteran German commanders. When German counterattacks came, American infantry held their positions. When panzer units tried to flank, American tank destroyers moved to intercept. When communications broke down, junior officers made tactical decisions without waiting for orders from the rear. The numbers told the story. Kasserine Pass, February 14th to 22nd. 6,500 American casualties, 183 tanks. Destroyed or captured 208 artillery. Pieces lost, 4,000 vehicles abandoned, complete tactical collapse. Getter, March 17th to 23rd. 2,000 American casualties, minimal equipment losses. German forces pushed back 15 miles, over 5,000 Axis soldiers killed or captured. First sustained American offensive success in the war. The transformation wasn't subtle. It was total. But the victory came at a cost. Patton's methods had worked. The structural changes: forward command posts, combined arms doctrine, aggressive reconnaissance had turned the Second Corps into a functional fighting force. But the human cost of those 11 days was staggering. During the battle, a battalion commander hesitated to commit his reserves. The delay lasted 20 minutes. The attack succeeded anyway. But when Patton found out, he relieved the commander immediately, not after the battle, but during it. The man had just led his unit to victory. And Patton destroyed his career in front of his staff. Another officer, a major who'd fought at Kasserine and performed well at El Getter, was fined $50 for arriving at a command meeting without proper insignia. He'd been awake for 36 hours. His uniform was covered in dust from the front. And Patton fined him anyway. The discipline that had rebuilt the Second Corps didn't stop when the shooting started. If anything, it intensified. Patton believed that victories bred complacency. So he maintained the same relentless pressure during the battle that he'd imposed during training. Officers were inspected. Fines were issued. Men were relieved, even in success. Fear remained the dominant force. The enemy noticed German commanders filed reports that acknowledged the change. One intelligence assessment from the 10th Panzer Division noted, American forces are demonstrating improved coordination and aggressive tactics. Their command structure appears to have been reorganized. Resistance is significantly stronger than observed at Kasserine. Rommel himself, who'd mocked American fighting ability just weeks earlier now, warned his officers not to underestimate U.S. forces. The army that had collapsed in February was holding ground in March. Patton had proven his point. Fear works. He'd also proven something darker. Eisenhower visited the front on March 20th, arrived unannounced, driving through units that had just secured El Getter. He spoke with enlisted men. He observed command posts. And he asked one question repeatedly: how is morale? The answers were complicated. Soldiers were proud of the victory. They'd proven they could fight. They'd beaten the same German forces that had humiliated them at Kasserine. But they also admitted something else. They were terrified of Patton. One sergeant told Eisenhower, "We fought hard, sir. Not because we wanted to prove anything. Because we were more afraid of the general than we were of the Germans." Another soldier said, "We won, but it doesn't feel like winning. It feels like surviving." Eisenhower didn't respond. He just listened because he understood what had happened. Patton had turned the Second Corps into an effective fighting force. But he'd done it by making his own men fear him more than the enemy. The victory at El Getter wasn't built on morale or esprit de corps. It was built on terror. And that created a question Eisenhower couldn't ignore. What happens when the fear runs out? March 23rd. The battle ended. El Getter was a success by every measurable standard. American forces had advanced. German forces had retreated. The Second Corps had proven it could execute offensive operations. Patton had won. But the cost wasn't measured in casualties alone. Over 30 officers had been relieved during the 11-day transformation. Dozens more had been fined, humiliated, or threatened. The officer corps wasn't just disciplined, it was traumatized. And the soldiers knew it. One private later wrote, "We beat the Germans at El Getter. But I'm not sure we beat them because we were better. I think we beat them because we were scared of what would happen if we didn't." That was Patton's legacy. He'd proven that a broken army could be rebuilt in 11 days. He'd proven that discipline, ruthlessly enforced, could turn defeat into victory. But he'd also proven something the U.S. Army would spend the rest of the war grappling with. Effectiveness and cruelty are not opposites. Sometimes they're the same thing. March 25, 1943. The Second Corps headquarters. The victory celebrations were brief. Eisenhower sent a congratulatory message. Washington praised the turnaround. Allied commanders acknowledged that American forces had finally proven themselves in combat. But inside the Second Corps, there were no celebrations. Because Patton's methods had left scars that victory couldn't erase. The officer corps was shattered in 11 days. Patton had relieved, reassigned, or demoted over 30 senior officers. Some deserved it. They'd failed at Kasserine, hesitated under pressure, or proven incompetent. But others hadn't failed at all. Major Robert Marsh had commanded an artillery battalion at Kasserine Pass. His guns had provided covering fire that allowed hundreds of soldiers to retreat safely. He'd stayed at his position until ammunition ran out, then destroyed his equipment rather than let it fall into German hands. At Algetter, his battalion performed flawlessly. His guns supported the infantry advance with precision. His men hit every target assigned. On March 21st, Patton relieved him. The reason? During an inspection 2 days earlier, Marsh had appeared without leggings. He'd been directing fire missions for 6 hours straight. His uniform was covered in dust and cordite, and Patton fined him $50 on the spot. Marsh paid the fine. But 2 days later, Patton reviewed his record and decided the violation demonstrated lack of attention to standards. Marsh was reassigned to a training command in Algeria. His career as a combat officer was over. He'd done everything right. And Patton destroyed him anyway. The message was clear. No one was safe. Marsh wasn't alone. Lieutenant Colonel James Hendricks had led a successful tank assault at Algetter, destroying 3 German positions and capturing over 100 enemy soldiers. He was recommended for the Silver Star. Patton denied the award. Why? Because during the attack, Hendricks had deviated from the operational plan. He'd seen an opportunity to flank a German strongpoint and taken it without waiting for authorization. The decision had worked. It shortened the battle and saved American lives, but Patton considered it insubordination. Hendricks wasn't relieved, but he wasn't promoted either. And the message spread through the officer corps like a disease. Success doesn't matter if you break the rules. Even if breaking the rules wins the battle, officers stopped taking initiative. They followed orders exactly, even when battlefield conditions changed. They feared Patton's judgment more than they feared failure. The army was disciplined, but it was also paralyzed. Soldiers paid the price. Patton's discipline didn't just target officers. Enlisted men were fined for uniform violations, for failing to salute, for standing in the wrong formation. Private Gerald Thompson was fined $10 for not wearing a helmet during a meal break 3 hours after his unit had been pulled off the front line. He'd fought at Algetter. He'd seen men die. And Patton fined him for taking off his helmet to eat. Corporal Anthony Martinez was reprimanded for having mud on his boots during an inspection. His squad had just spent 18 hours repairing defensive positions in the rain, and Patton called him disgraceful. These weren't isolated incidents. They were systematic. Patton believed that discipline had to be absolute. That if you allowed one man to violate standards, no matter how small, the entire structure would collapse. But soldiers didn't see it as discipline. They saw it as contempt. One sergeant later wrote, "Patton treated us like we were the enemy, like we'd personally humiliated him at Kasserine. He didn't rebuild our pride. He punished us for losing it in the first place." The human cost extended beyond careers. Captain William Davenport had commanded a company at Kasserine Pass. When his position was overrun, he'd ordered his men to retreat while he stayed behind to destroy sensitive documents. He was captured, held for 4 days, and escaped during a German withdrawal. When he returned to American lines, he expected a hero's welcome. Instead, Patton interrogated him. "Why didn't you fight to the last man?" Davenport explained. His position was indefensible. His men were outnumbered 5-1. Staying would have meant annihilation with no strategic benefit. Patton's response: "You abandoned your post." Davenport wasn't court-martialed, but he was reassigned to a staff position far from combat. His men who'd survived because of his decision wrote letters defending him. It didn't matter. Patton had decided that retreat, under any circumstances, was cowardice. Davenport spent the rest of the war behind a desk. He was 29 years old. He'd risked his life to save his men. And Patton ended his career for it. Even Patton's defenders couldn't justify everything. Omar Bradley, Patton's deputy, and a man who respected him deeply, later wrote, George believed that an army fights not because it loves its commander, but because it fears him more than the enemy. He was right. But he was also wrong, because fear breeds obedience, not loyalty. And eventually, an army built on fear will break in ways that discipline cannot fix. Bradley saw what was happening. Officers who'd fought bravely were being destroyed for minor infractions. Soldiers who'd proven themselves in combat were being treated like criminals. The Second Corps was effective, but it was also poisoned, and the poison came from the top. March 28th. Eisenhower made a decision. He summoned Patton to headquarters in Algiers. The meeting was private. No record was kept, but what was said became clear in the days that followed. On April 15th, Patton was reassigned. He would no longer command the Second Corps. Instead, he was given command of the 7th Army for the invasion of Sicily, a promotion on paper, but also a removal. Eisenhower's reasoning was never stated officially, but officers who served under both men understood. Patton had proven that brutality could win battles. But Eisenhower couldn't allow him to destroy the army in the process. The question remained, had Patton saved the Second Corps? Or had he broken it in a different way? The soldiers who fought at El Getter never forgot what he did. Some respected him for it. They believed his methods, harsh as they were, had given them the discipline they needed to survive. But others hated him. One veteran interviewed 40 years later said, "Patton turned us into winners. But he also turned us into men who were afraid to think for ourselves. We didn't fight because we believed in something. We fought because we were terrified of what would happen if we didn't. That was the cost." Patton had rebuilt an army, but he'd done it by making his own men fear him more than they feared death, and that fear never went away. Kasserine Pass didn't just expose American weakness. It revealed what the United States Army was willing to become in order to win. George Patton didn't rebuild the Second Corps through inspiration or leadership. He rebuilt it through fear, humiliation, and institutional cruelty. He stripped officers of rank. He destroyed careers for trivial violations. He made his own men more afraid of him than they were of the enemy, and it worked. El Getter proved that discipline, ruthlessly enforced, could turn a broken army into an effective fighting force. American soldiers advanced. They took objectives. They defeated the same German forces that had humiliated them weeks earlier, but the victory came at a cost that was never recorded in official reports. Over 30 officers had their careers ended not by the enemy, but by their own commander. Soldiers who'd fought bravely were punished for minor infractions. Men who'd survived Kasserine Pass were treated like criminals for failing to meet Patton's impossible standards. The Second Corps became effective, but it also became traumatized. Patton believed that armies don't fight out of loyalty or morale. They fight out of fear. And he was right, but only partially, because fear can win battles, but it can't sustain an army. Eventually, men stop fighting for victory. They fight only to avoid punishment, and that's not leadership. That's tyranny. Eisenhower understood this. That's why he removed Patton from the Second Corps after just 6 weeks. Not because Patton had failed, but because he'd succeeded in a way that threatened the entire command structure. Patton proved that you could rebuild a shattered army in 11 days. But he also proved that the methods required to do it would destroy the men you were trying to save. The question this documentary began with was simple. Why did Kasserine Pass force Patton to turn against his own command? The answer is darker than most history books acknowledge. Kasserine Pass didn't force Patton to turn against his men. It gave him permission. Patton had always believed that soldiers were tools, not people. That discipline was a weapon, not a philosophy. That fear was more effective than loyalty. Kasserine Pass simply gave him the authority to prove it, and he did. But the cost wasn't measured in German casualties or captured territory. It was measured in broken careers, shattered morale, and an officer corps that would spend the rest of the war terrified of making a single mistake. Patton turned the Second Corps into winners, but he also turned them into men who would never trust their own commanders again. That's the legacy of those 11 days in Tunisia, not victory, not redemption. Just the cold, brutal truth that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't across the battlefield. It's wearing the same uniform you are.